We can't keep this war bottled up in Ukraine. If it does come west, we start losing cities. And unfortunately, if the Ukrainians win, the only way that they can stop the Russians from trying again is to cross the border into Russia proper and take out a couple logistical hubs that unfortunately are also major cities, places like Belgorod and Rostov-on-Don. And that would probably prompt the Russians to use nukes in a defensive manner. So I know this sounds horrible, but a stalemate in Ukraine is probably the best case scenario for everyone except the Ukrainians. Anything short of winning is absolutely intolerable, but if they're going to use nukes in Ukraine, that really doesn't help them very much.
No, but why wouldn't the Russians use or threaten to use nukes on anyone supplying weapons to Ukraine at this point?
They did that in the first couple of months of the war, and two things happened. The Ukrainians proved that they could fight very well with very limited support from the West, at least temporarily. So there was a while when they were thinking about nuking Warsaw specifically, because that's where most of the weapons were funneled through. But when more and more countries signed online and when more and more supply routes to the Ukrainians opened up, that lost a lot of its justification. It was made very clear to Putin personally that we have real-time intelligence on his personal location at any given time. And so we made it very clear to him that if nukes were used on any NATO territory anywhere in the world, that the first nuke that would go back would be targeting him personally. And that focused a few minds in the Kremlin. If Ukraine falls, then it's a broader scale. And if Ukraine succeeds and all of a sudden the Russian border is the one that's under threat, then we're in a very different defensive strategic environment. At the moment, keeping the nukes off the table means keeping the war within Ukraine's borders, more or less.
Why is Putin suicidal under certain of these scenarios? Any significant use of nukes is obviously suicide.
The Russian demographic situation has decayed to such the point that without a more secure outer perimeter, they probably will be gone as a functional country before 2040. When that is your understanding of your own country, the strictness of the systems of mutually assured destruction and a degree of trust, ironically, that we had during the Soviet period is gone. The Russians feel that if they can't pull this off all the way to the Danube, to the Vistula, that they're doomed anyway. And so if they need nukes to get something that conventionally they can't get, they are fully willing to do that. Now, I would guess that what would happen in this specific scenario, and everyone's scenarios here are a little loosey-goosey because this war has evolved in so many directions that nobody anticipated. So take this for what it is, it's just a guess. If Ukraine falls and the Russian military reaches the border with Poland and Romania and the Balts, the Putin government would have a conference call with Germany or with Berlin and London and Stockholm and Washington. No, we probably wouldn't bring in Washington and in Paris and say, hey, look, we've already programmed the nukes. They're going to launch tomorrow at noon unless you repudiate your alliance with those 5 states and immediately and publicly begin your withdrawal forces from all 5 of them. If you do that, we won't launch. And they'll try to break NATO one last time. That's what I would do if I was Putin.
And what do you think NATO should do under those conditions? I mean, we have
NATO does not want to have to make that decision. That's why we're backing Ukraine.
And on that front, do you think we should be backing Ukraine much more energetically than we are?
I think it's possible. There's 2 problems here, though. Number one, the baby bus that hit the rest of the world hit Ukraine actually harder than most. So they only have so many troops. And they now have had so many troops so engaged for so long, it's difficult for them to rustle up more troops to get trained on more advanced equipment. The next phase of training for the Ukrainians is going to be much more difficult than what's happened to this point, just because of the numbers. So it's not clear to me, and I know all of my friends in the military are stressing about this too, about what can be done to move things forward, even if the politics in the United States were perfect, of which they are not. The second problem is a little bit broader on the European front. These Europeans spent 30 years preparing for a world where there would never be a war again. Mm-hmm. And after 2 years of giving the Ukrainians almost every weapon system they can think of, the cupboard's starting to get a little thin. So it's not clear to me what the next phase of the war is going to look like. Yes, the Russians have been exhausted. Yes, the Russians have lost all of their pre-war military, tanks, men, everything. But they have a Soviet stockpile to draw upon and another probably 6 million men in their 20s that they can draft. The West is going to have to figure out something else. Because even if the block on the aid in Congress goes away tomorrow, The Europeans are nearly spent. They've sent everything they can. And the United States is now starting to run out of the backlog of decommissioned military equipment that has been the bulk of our donations. About 80% by value, 70-80% by value of what we've sent is stuff that we don't use anymore. We have not really delved into our active equipment. And if we're going to continue support past this calendar year, we're either going to have to start making a lot of stuff that we haven't made in 30 years, or we're going to have to start training the Ukrainians on our top line equipment, which requires an order of magnitude more effort and supply and logistical tail. Whatever we go with requires a lot of military industrial expansion on the production side, and you don't do that overnight. So we're facing a number of crimp points in our support for Ukraine that is making this very uncomfortable.
Too much support would be a bad thing. It would tip us over into a nearer-term existential threat from the Russian point of view.
Absolutely a concern. I think that has become less of a concern over the last 16 months. The fact that the counteroffensives last year, from the Ukrainians did not amount to any significant breakthroughs. This is going to sound horrible. It gives the United States a little bit of confidence that that scenario, the Russians fighting a nuclear war defensively, is a little further off. There's nothing about this that is pretty for anyone.
All right. So how much land do you have in New Zealand, and what are your favorite MRE brands?
I actually have a New Zealand degree, and my job is portable, so I can qualify for citizenship in a day if I decide that I want to. And Peak Refuel is my go-to. Thank God for the preppers. They put a lot of money into that freeze-dried stuff. It actually tastes pretty good now. And I realize it's a probably on a maybe. But it's not something I spend too much time being overly stressed about, because at the moment, the strategic nukes are in the silos and controlled by a major power. And they are far more dangerous there today than they would be 15 years from now in some random dude's hands. Okay, I'm a fiscal conservative, so I really don't like talking about this issue. But it's really hard for me when I look at it geopolitically to get too concerned. And that doesn't mean that I think that Biden or Trump or Obama or W had the capacity of crafting a meaningful economic policy. I think they all failed. But a few things to look at. First of all, let's talk about outer reaches. How far can we go before it's a problem? Japan's national debt, if you include pension arrears today, is over 500% of GDP, so 4 times ours. And they're still there, and they are not the global currency. So even in the worst case scenario, we can quadruple our debt from our current levels, and it might make for some uncomfortable thinking in a number of ways, but it wouldn't destroy the country. Second, we get a lot free. As long as we maintain our long-term growth pattern, which for the last 50 years has been about 3% a year. That means the first $850 billion of debt is kind of free because it doesn't expand the debt load as a percentage of the economy. That's a lot of wiggle room. And in a number of years of the last 20, our deficit expansion has been below that level. Third, there is no hint of any challenge to the US dollar as the global currency. And as long as that is the case, anything that we do that is debt-driven actually hurts most of the rest of the world more than everybody else, and actually reduces the cost of the US dollar versus other currencies. And considering most of the other currencies are facing long-term degradation from demographic reasons, having a little degradation of our own actually makes us a little bit more competitive. Not my preferred way of getting there, but you take your good news where you can these days. The Europeans confiscated the insured bank deposits of the depositors during their financial crisis, and so everyone who could get out of the euro did. It's just a regional currency now. It's sufficient for that purpose, but it's never going to be a global competitor. The Brits removed them from the equation with Brexit, especially since they haven't figured out what's next. The Japanese tried to go global in the 80s and it blew up in their face, and they will never try that again. The Chinese yuan is not convertible, and people forget that the money supply in China is over double what it is here, despite the fact that they're not a currency of trade and they're not a currency that stores value. They've done everything to their money supply that all the gold hawks say that the Fed is doing, and they've been doing it harder and longer. So there's no competition there. And my personal favorite is BRICS, because in the opening statements in Johannesburg last year, the Chinese, Indians, and South Africans, all in their opening statements, said they had no interest in a BRICS currency at all, And they wanted just the dollar system to continue, and would people please stop asking them about it? But that doesn't match with the discussion in financial circles in the United States. So that was very underreported.
Mm-hmm.